that little introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak as well this evening. As Mike said, I work for the Wild Planet Trust, which is a charity that is basically, we have two zoos, Paignton Zoo and Newquay Zoo, but we also have 3 nature reserves as well. So we have a couple of nature reserves around Paignton Zoo within Paignton itself, and we also own the Slapton Lane National Nature Reserve down on the South Devon coast, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. So quite a diverse kind of mix of sites, really. The charity is kind of like the umbrella for all those various kind of other sites and enterprises that sit within it. So I'm based actually at Paignton, and I've been the conservation officer there. Someone reminded me the other day, actually 15 years, which I can't believe. So my role there is to manage our projects that are in the UK. So the Wild Planet Trust has overseas projects as well, so we work a lot in Africa and Indonesia as well. So I manage our native species stuff, and some of that is on our reserves, but some of it, like Seagrass project, is local but exists outside our site, if you like. So I'm going to share my screen now. And you'll see something that doesn't look like a seagrass meadow, but is actually a meadow. So I shall replace that with something more appropriate. Okay, so that's us. That's a Wild Planet Trust. We've actually sort of rebranded a number of years ago. So if you're familiar with Paignton Zoo, you might remember the Whitley Wildlife Conservation Trust, but we've been Wild Planet Trust for a few years now. We felt that kind of better reflected what we did. So I'm going to do a bit of a talk generally about seagrass, and finish up talking about our project. So if I can just get my, there we go, all going. So just a bit of an overview of what is seagrass and what it isn't. What's kind of interesting and important about it, it is quite a unique selection of species and unique habitats that the plants themselves create. In terms of conservation of seagrass, obviously we're interested in what threats there are, of which unfortunately there are many, and what we've done, but also some of the things that are going on to try and combat some of those threats, and why they happen as well, and a bit about our project, Save Our Seagrass project. And I see that we have some of our lovely volunteers in the audience tonight, so that's great, and they probably know more about this than I do, to be honest, because they're fabulous and they're out there doing this stuff all the time. So seagrass is actually a common name for a group of flowering plants. So these are plants that actually evolved to live in the sea from land, so they spread into that marine environment. And in relatively recent times, in sort of the geological time scale, if you like. So the interesting thing about them is they actually they flower, they set seed. So in flowering, they pollinate, each other, and they do this whole life cycle completely submerged in the marine environment. And they're the only group of plants that are actually able to do this, and they're kind of lumped together in this kind of broad term of seagrasses, and that's their kind of common name. So they have quite an interesting it's an interesting mode, if you like, and I always just think it's completely amazing that they actually pollinate, under the water. The pollen grains actually spread and are carried by the water to fertilize the the flowers and produce seeds, which are then also spread by the water as well. So they have they've got a number of other common names. So there's a number of species worldwide, and their common names sort of reflect their many shapes and sizes really, and their roles in marine ecosystems. So we tend to call one of the, well, a couple of species we have in the UK, eelgrass, but there's also turtle grass, tape grass, shoal grass, and spoon grass as well. So you can imagine the shapes of the leaves there. So as I say, these are quite different from seaweed. I'm just good. This is probably teaching Granny to suck eggs a little bit, but it's worth kind of mentioning that they are actually quite different. Seaweeds, although in general appearance, you know, they kind of have a similar kind of look. They both kinds of plants photosynthesize, and they have this kind of leafy look about them, but the cell structure and the vascular system, or the presence of a vascular system in the seagrass, makes it a very different thing indeed. So we actually have rhizomes, which are horizontal underground stems, you know, that sit within the sediment under seagrass, and then we have roots that come out from that. We can see that, you know, typical algae will have a holdfast, and literally its only function pretty much is to keep it where it is, hanging, you know, the clue is in the name there. So although they, you know, if you're wading around and you've got some green stuff swishing around your legs, you might kind of think it's all seaweed. Actually, you could be amongst some seagrass there as well. And as I say, they produce little tiny flowers, the seagrass, and seeds as well. So if you're actually under the water looking at them at the right time of year, you can actually see those kind of features, which is quite interesting. And so, I always just think this is a very strange little feature of them. They have enormous pollen grains. I think the largest pollen grains of any flowering plant. They're sort of up to about 0.5 centimetre long, which doesn't sound that long, but when you consider most pollen, you have to use a microscope to be able to see the actual pollen grains. So these are quite large, presumably to enable them to be carried through the water and to find the the female parts of the flowers as well. So if we just sort of have a little look at the root structure there, which actually I won't dwell on too much, but it actually is really important when it comes to some of the benefits of seagrass. So you've got this roots and rhizome underground system, and here this picture is very simplified, but actually those rhizome mats can be really, really deep. They can go sort of meters down into the sediment, and that is incredibly important when it comes to binding that sediment, so holding it in place, and protecting the sediment, keeping it where it is. But also something else that we'll come on to, one of the benefits of seagrass is the carbon storage, which is the very hot topic at the moment. But this is kind of where it all happens really, and it's a function of the fact that it has this fantastic kind of network of rhizomes and roots that sit within the substrate under the seabed. So that's what it looks like. I should say actually that I do need to have a big thank you to many of our volunteers who supplied some of the photographs for this talk. We do have 1 or 2 really expert photographers, and I've got some of their photographs scattered liberally through here. So yes, thank you to those, and I will give you a little mention as we go through, because yeah, it's great. So I've mentioned that there are several species worldwide. In the UK, we've got a number of species. We've actually got 3 species of eelgrass. So that's the genus Zostera. So primarily we think of having 2 species here really. We have Zostera marina, which is the common eelgrass, which is mostly what the rest of this talk is about, actually, because that's what we have in Torbay. There's also the dwarf eelgrass, which is obviously smaller. It's slightly Zostra marina will occur at sort of slightly deeper water. So Zostra noltii, which is the dwarf eelgrass we also have. There is a narrow-leafed eelgrass, Zostra angustifolia, which used to be kind of combined, I think, with Zostra marina, and then was kind of differentiated, but it can be quite hard to tell apart. So this image is our common eelgrass. So this is the most common one that we have in UK, as its name suggests, with these lovely dark green ribbony shaped leaves that can reach sort of 20 to 50 centimetres, or even up to a metre, actually. A couple of our divers have discussions about what was the longest seagrass they've been in, and apparently one of them had disappeared into it once. So we know that it can get quite tall. And it forms these amazing kind of dense underwater meadows. And in fact, it has that picture I threw up at the beginning, which is my screensaver, which is a wildflower meadow. In some ways, it has quite a lot in common with that kind of terrestrial environment, really. You've got this kind of dense sward of grass-like leaves, and within there's a huge array of species diversity that can occur in there, from things that live actually on the seagrass and things that shelter, things that live between and in the sort of sandy substrate that they like to grow in. And that includes both of the UK species of seahorse and their relatives, the pipefish. This is one of Tamsin's lovely photos. So Tamsin is one of our volunteer divers who takes incredible pictures. This is quite interesting, actually. I don't think she realised she'd got a picture of this pipefish in her quadrat. We'll come to that a bit later on, what they do, but one of the pictures that came back, when she zoomed in, she realised there's a pipefish in there. So this is the broad-nosed pipefish, and you can see how well camouflaged it is amongst the seagrass. So interestingly that she hadn't spotted it. So where do we find seagrass? So in the UK, it occurs around potentially quite a bit of coastlines. This is slightly misleading. This is an image from the online atlas of British and Irish flora. So this is based on actual records that have been submitted to that database. If we look at the green blobs, which are the most recent ones, you can see that there's not so many of those. It is quite difficult looking back at historical records and even current records, actually. There's some parts of the shoreline that are quite well mapped, but other places it's not so. And often old and more recent records are based on stranded plants. So the extent to which this map actually reflects the distribution of actually rooted seagrass beds is quite difficult to assess. But if closer to home, in Torbay, so this is where we work. I'm sure a couple of you have seen this picture a lot of times. So this is the green hatched area is actually the marine conservation zone, which you can see hugs the coast there. Which stretches from Hope's Nose in the sort of up in the north area to Berry Head down in the south, roughly, and hugs the coast. And that's about 20 square kilometres of protected coast and sort of shoreline seabeds there. The little red wiggly blobs are some of the seagrass. Oh, so an annoying little time thing on there. So you can see that it very much, the seagrass hugs the shore, and in fact typically seagrass grows in shallow bays and estuaries and lagoons and very close to our coastline, down to sort of about 8 or 10 meters in our sea. So which again makes it quite vulnerable, but this gives you a little idea of what it looks like in Torbay. I would say that the they can be a bit misleading. They look like huge beds, but the two large blobs that we have there in the north and the south of the bay are actually very, very patchy. So that is just the sort of extent of those beds, roughly. So we've sort of talked about a couple of these things. Why is seagrass so important? It's a hugely diverse habitat. There's so many species that live in it. It has this amazing function of protecting the coast from erosion by means of that sort of rhizome mat that I talked about, where it holds that sediment in place. It actually is really great at filtering sediment and other nutrients from the water, which can be to its detriment as well, actually, because of high nutrient loadings are quite toxic for seagrass. But it constantly builds and secures sediment, which buffers, our coast from erosion and storms and flooding as well. And the meadows themselves reduce the force impact of wave action, by the sort of movement of their leaves. And it's even been shown that even quite cropped short seagrass still functions really well to retain that sediment. So we can see that actually it's a lot of it's down to that sort of mat of rhizomes. It's really important. So the other sort of features that are often said, so the protection of its leaves are really key for the survival of juvenile fish, including a lot of commercial species. And the other thing that we'll look at in a minute is this whole carbon sequestration thing, which is very popularly talked about at the moment, but it is actually quite amazing, some of the facts and figures around seagrass. So if we kind of just explore the sort of nature of it as a juvenile fish nursery, I thought this was a fabulous photo. Again, this came from a previous project to ours, but it just shows all the little fish there sheltering amongst the leaves. And fish they're really most vulnerable when they're small, and this nursery habitat really helps provide that refuge from predation, and also they find food there, and they themselves are food a little bit for other things as well. And there's been quite a lot of research looking at kind of meta-analysis of global research on juvenile fish, and really demonstrate that there's just overwhelming evidence that fish abundance, growth and survival are much greater in seagrass beds than in sort of more unstructured habitats where they haven't got this kind of structural diversity that the seagrass itself provides. And commercial species such as Atlantic cod, so your fish and chips cod, will select seagrass habitat over unstructured habitat, and are found to grow faster and have a greater survival. So it's really important for fish species, also including, we could not have some lovely cuttlefish pictures. I think these are tamsins as well, taken in Beacon Cove in Torbay. And cuttlefish, always quite a joy, I think, for the divers to come across. They will be using the seagrass very much to lay their eggs, and we can see this sort of classic clump of cuttlefish eggs up in the top right there. And in fact, we're hoping this year that we're going to try and do some cuttlefish egg surveys as well. Cuttlefish are very important commercially. They do pop for them in seagrass and trawl them out at sea, possibly a little too much. But again, there's an amazing, charismatic and really interesting group of animals. And it always, yeah, as I say, a joy to see, really. So to come to the carbon bit. Now, there's lots of, I've just realised there's some writing missing there. There's a lot of stats around how amazing seagrass is for storing, so actually taking in carbon and then actually storing it, so sequestering it within the sediment. And a lot of people compare it to tropical rainforests and all these other kind of terrestrial environments. It's a highly productive habitat, and all the while it's photosynthesizing, so it's taking in carbon dioxide and converting that into, you know, its own structures, and including those rhizomes. And it can do that really, really efficiently. It's never limited by lack of water, which is something that can often limit photosynthesis on land. So terrestrial plants are limited by things like temperature, CO2, water, all those kind of things. And wetland habitats have sometimes less of those constraints. They can be quite effective photosynthesizers. But one of the things that it does really well, or how it works really, is the fact that it has in common with things like mangrove swamps, peat bogs actually, and other things like that. It has a very anaerobic, so very little oxygen within the sediment, so it's an anaerobic environment. And what that does is it kind of holds the carbon. Whenever you get oxygen in the soil or in the sediments in the sea, it enables the carbon cycle to sort of go around that cycle, and CO2 is released back into the water. But because it's very anoxic, the carbon actually stays in the sediment. So the seagrass is photosynthesizing, so it's pulling in carbon dioxide to start with, but it also takes in a lot of carbon as particulate matter or other debris from other organisms that have been alive. And because of the nature of it, it traps them. You know, it gets stuck between the leaves, and all of that kind of decomposes down and then becomes part of the carbon that's locked into the sediment under the seagrass. So that's one of the key areas why it's actually so effective, and it almost has an infinite capacity to do that, and it will keep that carbon there for potentially hundreds of years. I mean, these seagrass beds have been there for thousands of years, and work that was done using stable isotopes, for anyone interested in that sort of thing, but basically they looked at seagrass derived carbon in the sediments around seagrass beds, and found that obviously it was underneath the seagrass, but it also occurred at quite big distances away from the seagrass. So there's actually, it's responsible for a lot of carbon within the substrate or the sediment around the seagrass bed, so much further. It has a much bigger footprint, if you like, than just the limit of the seagrass bed itself. And we've got a few sort of stats there. The ocean is sort of responsible for about 83% of the global carbon sort of intake. I mean, the ocean has an enormous capacity for taking in carbon dioxide, but because it's a cyclic thing, it releases it as well. But seagrass, even though it's tiny, in fact, that's supposed to be 0.1% of the area of the ocean floor, it's actually responsible for something like 11% of that carbon that's sequestered in ocean sediment. So it sort of really punches above its weight. And it can sequester something like 83 grams 83 grams of carbon per square metre per year, so 830 kilos per hectare, if you want to sort of work that out. And a paper looking at how much seagrass we have left, estimates we've got something like 8,500 hectares in the UK. So I will leave the maths to you, because you're probably better at it than me. So this is great news in terms of, you know, what seagrass can do. But this is healthy seagrass. So the healthier the seagrass, the better it is at doing this. The longer the leaves are, the more dense it is, the better it's going to be at photosynthesizing and trapping and doing that carbon sequestration. So that's all well and good, but we know that seagrass is in trouble, and the disturbance of the seabed, so any sort of dredging of that sediment or disturbance in any way, releases CO2 back out into the water and then into the environment. That also actually applies to obviously areas that have carbon in the seabed. So there are other, the seabed will contain carbon, and whenever it's dredged up, the carbon dioxide or carbon is released and then ends up as CO2 going back into the atmosphere. So healthy seagrass, good for the planet. Damaged seagrass is a lot less effective, and disturbed seagrass releases carbon back out into that system again. So this is why everyone's quite excited about it, and why it's really important that we firstly really look after what we've got and try and get it into the best possible state it can be, and really try and allow it to expand. So this is a slight back of the envelope calculation that I did for the Torbay bed. So we've got about 52-ish hectares of seagrass in Torbay. And according to a report that was done about the tree assets, which also included seagrass in Torbay, they had a kind of carbon conversion of tons to pounds. So I'm not sure how they do that, but there's some magic little equation there somewhere. So I just put some carbon sequestration amounts next to that, based on some research that was done locally in the southwest, looking at how much carbon there was stored below seagrass beds in lots of different places. So this was kind of an average of that, so not the best, not the worst, and just sort of extrapolated out. And so that's a sort of a ballpark, but actually Torbay, we know in a lot of places doesn't have very good seagrass beds. They are in a state of recovery. They've been very badly damaged in the past. So really what we're looking at is that there's a lot of room for improvement, I think, is probably what we can say. But it's kind of interesting exercise to do, and certainly, there are certain people that like to put monetary values on things, so you can sort of do that. So as I say, seagrass is in trouble. There's quite a lot of threats that impact seagrass. Just to jump down to that kind of bottom figure, really, a recent paper looked at the evidence of occurrence over time. They used lots of different sources of information and concluded that there had been a loss of at least 44% of the UK seagrass beds in the last couple of 100 years, but actually they were quite convinced it was a gross underestimate, and they thought it could be as high as over 90%, which is quite worrying, especially when you look at those kind of figures from the last slide, when you talk about how much carbon, it's potential for storing carbon has been lost, actually. And worryingly as well, nearly 40% of that is just in the last 40 years. In fact, a lot since the 1980s has really been impacted by this list of things. So I mentioned how good seagrass is at taking up nutrients and sediments, but unfortunately too much of it has a negative effect. So having too much nutrient in the water leads to a sort of overgrowth of algae, and that smothers the plants, so they can't photosynthesize very well. The amount of sediment in the water does the same thing. So problems that we have from runoff, agricultural runoff, from sewage discharges directly in the sea. I mean, I remember that was a thing when I lived in, I grew up in Torbay, and it was, raw sewage was discharged straight out into the bay without any treatment or anything at all. And that was, well, I probably don't want to say when that was, but certainly up until the 90s, when they sort of revised the sewage system. But unfortunately, we still see discharges from storm overflows and agricultural runoff as well, which carries both the sediments and the nutrient, as well as a whole bunch of other nasty chemicals that come from our sort of urban urban runoff as well. So these are all kind of big issues in terms of the water that the seagrass grows in, but we also see direct damage. Now, fortunately, we have a marine conservation zone in Torbay now, so it's protected from the scallop dredging that undoubtedly scoured out huge amounts of it in Torbay, and has probably led to the fact that it's in a very much a recovering kind of state these days. Anchorings and swing moorings, they all cause physical damage of that kind of rhizome mat, the all important rhizome mat. I'll come back to swing moorings in a minute, but we can have a look at what they do to seagrass, which is not great. Increased recreational pressure, so that also leads to more anchoring, more disturbance of the sediment, bringing it up into the water column for their invasive species and disease. In fact, a big loss was back in the 1930s from a sort of wasting disease that carried on having impact up until the 80s, really, and a lot was lost from there. But what we don't know actually is how much was lost even before that. So it was undoubtedly pressures before that causes really, reduced seagrass. So yes, it's not a happy state. So this is I just did this as a quick screen grab earlier on today. So this is quite current. This is an aerial photograph, and if any of you sat through seagrass talks before, you've probably seen something like this. This is the Isles of Scilly in St Mary's, and there's a lot of seagrass in that picture, so that's all the dark areas. But can you see around each mooring, or a lot of those moorings, you've got kind of circles of clear sand, and that's what the swing moorings do. So you've got a boat moored at the top. The chain riser at low tide will spin round around as the tide changes direction and pretty much scour all life, and in this case seagrass, but actually, if it's in other habitats as well, it has a very damaging effect on the seabed. So that's kind of your traditional moorings, and these are just some rather grainy pictures, but these were taken by Rachel Coles, who used to be the project lead for the CSI project, the Community Seagrass Initiative, which I'll talk about a little bit in a minute. But she just took these pictures of, anchors in the seabed, which happens a lot, and what it looks like afterwards. And you can see, probably not that well, but you can see the bare sand, and if you look carefully, you can see kind of ripped up and damaged rhizomes around. And I think people can be a bit blasé about the effect of anchoring and say, well, we've been anchoring in there for a long time, but actually what they don't kind of consider is the fact that these seagrass beds are often in quite a poor state already, and this is kind of another little nail in the coffin. If you had a vibrant, wonderful dense seagrass bed, probably the odd anchor is not going to do so much harm, but it's adding sort of threats onto things that are there already. So that's the sort of background really for our project. That might even be Sue, who's on this call, I'm not sure. So we have a number of funders, which I've put their logos on there. So our project is quite a recent one, really. We've only really been running this project for the last sort of 3 or 4 years. We missed the COVID year, but it very much built on a previous project that I just mentioned, the Community Seagrass Initiative, which was a big lottery funded project that stretched all the way from Lewin, Cornwall to Weymouth, and really was about engaging lots of volunteer divers, really kind of engaging the local community and the local dive community with their seagrass, who came and helped do lots of surveys and collected data. There was a whole wealth of education and outreach and all sorts of things that went on. And we were partners in that for the Torbay area. And when it came to an end in about 2017, we had this amazing group of volunteer divers that had been working with that project, and we were really keen to have some continuation locally. So we kind of set ourselves a few simple things to do. We wanted to get a sort of regular dive monitoring method set up, really. So the CSI collected a lot of general data across various beds, and we looked at collecting a little bit more in detail, a bit more species data. They'd also trialled some seagrass friendly moorings, a little cove called Fishcombe, which, if you know, is down near Brixham. And we also felt that the public engagement side of things was immensely important, and it's something actually that we're focusing on even more sort of now. And Megan, who's on this call as well, has been working really hard actually recently, sort of developing that side of things. So it really kind of hangs on our volunteers, I have to say. Without it, we couldn't do this. And I say we, I didn't get to dive. So actually they kind of do it all. They're amazing, and they're amazing ambassadors for seagrass, which is fantastic. So this is a bit of a mugshot. One of the times I did go out last year, I think, so on one of our sites. So a really friendly group of people. We've got an amazing skipper, Warwick Saunders, who skippers the boat, and pretty much, well, he does a lot more than that. We couldn't do it without him as well. His kind of expertise and experience are amazing, and he basically gives boat cover for all the dives that we do, so that they're sort of done as safely as they possibly can, even though it's in quite shallow water. So our divers, when they're under the water, I say they're amazing advocates for the marine environment and are amazingly passionate, which is just as well, because this can be quite challenging sometimes with some of the visibility. And so we're really grateful to them. So we started out really in earnest in 2019, and we wanted to collect kind of baseline data on other species associated with the seagrass, as well as this sort of density of the seagrass as well. So we set up we had repeatable methods that were set up at known locations that we could go back and resurvey. And the divers worked along a transect, so the line put out along the seabed, and they took with them a quadrat. You can see the quadrat on the right-hand picture there. So just a square that they would lay down on the seabed, take photographs and record everything that they found in there, as well as things like leaf length and shoot density. That's quite a nice, fairly dense quadrat, that one. So that was the sort of first year, really, where we would sort of getting a feel for the project as well, and getting to know the divers and really finding out quite a lot about what was down there. So we chose 6, well, there are 6 kind of main seagrass beds. We do have some other smaller little ephemeral ones that come and go. So we surveyed 6 of them throughout the year. As I say, they recorded all the species, so they wrote them down on a slate, took photos so we could verify that data when it comes back up. And over that year, 450 quadrats of data were collected, and they found 62 species across those 6 beds, mostly quite similar. The seagrass, the sort of animal, the faunal communities found within the seagrass were quite similar. Couldn't really find differences between those beds, apart from where we were near rocky reefs. So occasionally we get other species in that were more associated with that. We found a distinct kind of increase with the abundance and diversity of species that we saw with seagrass shoot density, so that we knew that the best and densest bits of seagrass were really where most of the creatures were found. Which in itself is really good. But what it did give us was a nice baseline, and something that we wouldn't do every year as quite an intense piece of work, because I'm sure that our volunteers will attest to, but actually it's something that we can revisit, and we can look at changes over time, which is immensely useful. So one of the other things that our volunteers do is a bit of a mapping. This is quite an interesting picture on the top right. So what we do is we send divers down with camera, and they have a surface marker buoy with a GPS attached to it. So they may swim out on a bearing or do circular patterns, and here this is just a little diagram to try and show them how to do these circular searches. So some of that was to try and ground truth some of those ephemeral beds. Are they still there? What's going on? And some of it was just to get a bit more information. It's quite hard navigating underwater, often when you can't see where you're going, and those dots in that top right show the tracks of some of our divers. I'm not quite sure where the ones to the north were disappearing off to around the headland, but there wasn't any seagrass there. So the darker blobs are where they found seagrass. So we've done quite a bit more of that more recently. So this is the sort of pink and purple blobs in that picture are actually polygons from previous surveys done by IFCA. So those are just rough extents of previous surveys where seagrass had been found. So we were trying to get a little bit more detail there. I'll show you a sort of slightly better one in a minute. But we were also very interested in combating that kind of boat mooring issue that is quite prevalent in Torbay. Torbay has an immense recreational pressure on it. It is so busy out there. And I've already showed you what happens when you put normal moorings in. So this is advanced mooring system. So this was developed by Ocean Conservation Trust in conjunction with other people to try and develop something. There's a few variations. If you're familiar with these advanced mooring systems, there's a few different ones, some with elastic risers and things, but this was the one that we went for. So it's got a couple of features about it which make it really useful. So the riser is kept off the seabed, which is the key thing. So it's not grinding and scouring around and creating those halos around the moorings. But also we tried where possible to use these helical screws, so we're not putting big blocks onto the seabed as well. And then it has a surface buoy which boats can moor up to. So as I say, this was built on a trial that was done previously as part of the previous project, and we sort of learned quite a lot actually from a couple of things that didn't go quite to plan from some of the previous ones, which was quite useful. So this is just a little screenshot. Sorry, it's a bit grainy, but this is 2018, just from Google Earth, just to show you what fish can look like. And those are all boats anchored in a tiny little cove. And actually, sometimes it's a lot worse than that. So it's really intense there, actually. It's very busy. So what we wanted to do was carry out some of that mapping to really pin down where we might put moorings and make sure we get them in the right place. So again, we did the mapping where the divers swim round and round, and here you can see the circular plans round and round, taking photos, and then we basically geo-reference the photograph so we can see how much seagrass is on the bed at that point, at various sort of categories. So with the darker green being the denser sort of cover. So in the sort of top right where it says first buoy something or other, that's where the old trial one was. So that was still there actually when we looked at installing new ones, and in fact that was taken out at the same time as we put 3 new ones in at the locations that are marked there. So there's a sort of difference in approach. So the old one was off the seagrass, but what had been found was that when boats were moored onto the mooring or took up the mooring, it pushed other boats to then anchor on the seagrass, which is obviously really what we didn't want. So we've actually put the moorings within the seagrass, which protects them. Once you've got a boat moored on it, nothing else is going to anchor in that swing area. So it's quite effective. So that's kind of view of some boats on the moorings, and that's kind of where they were in terms of a nicer picture. It's a lovely cove, really beautiful, which is, you know, it's not surprising it's so popular. So we were quite keen to evaluate how effective these moorings were. So we did some observations from the surface and looked at camera footage set at a very low resolution, I have to add, so there's nothing identifiable in it, but you can see if boats are moored or anchored. And we had a 40-day, we had footage from 43 days before and after the moorings went in, and we just saw such a big difference. So if we look at the before and after, that's the blue is before and the grey is after. If we look at the mooring, so the mooring that happened before was on this one mooring that was there, so we can see that obviously there's an increase in moorings that happened before and after. So we were going from one mooring to 3 moorings, which we would expect, but we saw this massive big drop in anchoring, which is what we really wanted to see. We can see that dropped right down. We sort of divided the cove a little bit into the inner area where the seagrass predominantly was, and the outer area. So the third pair of columns, if you like, from the left shows the anchoring that happened before and after. So where we were really interested was that inner area, and we just saw this big drop of anchoring in that, actually on the seagrass. And an increase of anchoring further out, actually, which was kind of okay because the seagrass doesn't occur further out. A few sort of interesting things that we saw. So significantly more power boats, I have to say, anchored in the shallow water, which you kind of might expect generally, and there wasn't much difference before and after with power boats. They carried on anchoring in the shallow water. The sort of sailing boats, which tended to be bigger, if they did anchor, they were doing it further out, but they certainly used the moorings as well. There was an increase in take up. So that was a kind of typical view, really. I think that was taken from the dive boat, actually, of what we kind of wanted to see, which is great. In fact, we had one boat that was anchored in the seagrass while the moorings were being installed, and then due to the noise from the hydraulics screwing the helical screw into the seabed, the guy on it obviously woke him up, I think. And anyway, he then moored on the moorings as soon as it was in. So within the same day, he'd gone from anchoring there to taking up the moorings. So definitely very popular. So we're currently doing, obviously, post-installation monitoring. So our divers again do lots of monitoring, looking at seagrass kind of size and density, and they do that on bearings out from each of the moorings, but we also do comparable sites as well to just eliminate sort of other variables. So yes, quite busy. I'm just gonna stick up a couple of lovely pictures from a couple of our volunteers before I finish, and I just wanted to finish on this one, really, because we need some more help. We've got great volunteers, but we need more. So if you're a UK diver or do UK diving, and you can contribute as little or as much as you can, and spread the word. So maybe you know divers who might be interested. And I've put an email there, which I can also stick in the chat, which is our kind of a contact email if you're interested in the project, or you'd like to come and volunteer, or you just want to find out some more. And I would, which I should have put on here, actually say that we have an event on the 4th of February. So we've our volunteers are coming for lunch, which is great, but after lunch we're going to have an afternoon of some sort of marine themed conservation talks of stuff going on in Torbay, a little bit of a varied selection. So we've obviously got some stuff about seagrass, and that's from ourselves, but also from Ocean Conservation Trust, who we work with quite a lot, and a couple of other organisations doing quite different things, from education to kind of counting cetaceans and things. So if you want to find out more, contact us using that link. And if I'm really quick, I might be able to stick the booking link in the chat, but I'm not sure about that. I shall try when I've finished sharing my screen. So just wanted to say thank you for listening. And I shall stop sharing my screen and we can have some questions.